Caitlin Clark was supposed to disappear for a few days. No cameras. No press conferences. No debates about ratings, rivalries, or whether she had already changed the entire WNBA. Just a quiet reset in Miami after one of the most chaotic seasons women's basketball had ever seen. But that plan lasted about 5 minutes. Because late that night, just before midnight, something happened that nobody expected. Something that sent social media into complete meltdown before sunrise. Caitlin Clark wasn't alone. Witnesses at a private oceanfront lounge in Miami say she stepped out of a black SUV surrounded by security. Nothing unusual about that. Famous athletes move like that all the time. What was unusual was the person stepping out beside her. Sophie Cunningham. Yes, that's Sophie Cunningham. The same player fans were convinced couldn't stand Caitlin Clark. The same player whose on-court clashes with Clark had already gone viral dozens of times. Clips of the two bumping shoulders, exchanging cold stares, and playing just a little too aggressively had been circulating all season. To most fans, their relationship looked simple. Two competitors. Two personalities that didn't mix. Two players on opposite sides of the league's biggest spotlight. But now here they were. Together. Late at night. Walking into a restricted lounge where staff members were reportedly told to give them space. And according to one employee who later spoke anonymously, the conversation between them wasn't casual. It wasn't friendly either. It looked intense. Sophie leaning forward, speaking sharply. Caitlin shaking her head more than once. At one point Sophie reportedly pulled something out of a backpack and slid it across the table. Papers. Real documents. And that's when one witness claims they heard the sentence that set the internet on fire the next morning. If we do this, everything changes. No one knew what this meant. But the idea of Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham secretly meeting behind closed doors immediately sent fans into speculation mode. Because if you had been following the WNBA that season, you already knew something strange had been brewing. Caitlin Clark hadn't just entered the league. She had exploded into it. Record-breaking college numbers. Sellout arenas. Television ratings the league hadn't seen in years. Suddenly, every conversation about women's basketball seemed to revolve around one name. And whenever a single star rises that fast, the pressure around them grows just as quickly. Some players welcomed it. Others weren't so sure. But what nobody expected was that one of the most talked-about rivals in Clark's story might secretly be trying to warn her about something bigger happening behind the scenes. Because according to multiple rumors circulating among insiders, Sophie Cunningham didn't fly to Miami for a friendly chat. She came because she believed Caitlin Clark was about to walk into a situation she didn't fully understand. And if Sophie was right, the entire future of the WNBA could be heading toward a collision no one was prepared for. From the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional court, it was obvious something unusual was happening around her. Not just the kind of excitement that follows a talented rookie, but the kind of cultural momentum that sports leagues spend decades trying to create. Long before she entered the WNBA, Clark had already built a reputation that stretched far beyond college basketball. At the University of Iowa, she didn't just win games. She shattered scoring records, packed arenas across the country, and turned regular-season college matchups into national television events. Suddenly people who had never watched women's basketball were tuning in just to see what she would do next. By the time she declared for the WNBA draft, the anticipation around her arrival had reached a level the league had rarely experienced before. Ticket demand spiked. Television partners began promoting upcoming games months in advance. Entire marketing campaigns quietly shifted toward one central figure, the player many believed could carry the league into a new era of attention and revenue. And when Clark finally arrived, the impact was immediate. Arenas started filling up in cities that hadn't sold out games in years. Jerseys sold out online within hours. Highlight clips of her deep three-pointers and fearless playmaking spread across social media faster than the league's official accounts could even post them. Even casual sports fans who normally followed the NBA or NFL suddenly knew her name. To some, it felt like a breakthrough moment for women's basketball. The arrival of a star capable of pulling the entire sport into a bigger spotlight. But explosive success in professional sports rarely happens without friction. Behind the scenes, Not everyone was comfortable with how quickly the narrative around the league had shifted. For years, dozens of elite players had carried the WNBA through difficult seasons, fighting for attention, recognition, and fair coverage from mainstream media. Many of them had spent entire careers pushing the league forward piece by piece. Now, almost overnight, the conversation seemed to revolve around one rookie. Some players welcomed the attention Clark brought with her. More viewers meant more opportunities for everyone. Bigger ratings meant better sponsorship deals and potentially higher salaries down the road. From that perspective, Clark's rise looked like the best thing that could have happened to the sport. But others quietly wondered what it meant for the balance inside the league. When one athlete becomes the center of every headline, every broadcast, and every promotional campaign, it inevitably creates tension. Questions start circulating in locker rooms and agent meetings. Who gets the marketing deals? Who gets the primetime games? Who gets pushed to the background while the spotlight narrows around a single face? That tension didn't always show up in interviews or official statements. Professional athletes are used to controlling their public image. But fans began noticing small moments on the court, subtle signs that not everyone felt comfortable with the league's new superstar narrative. And that's where Sophie Cunningham's name kept appearing in the conversation. Cunningham had already built a reputation as one of the most intense competitors in the league. She played with visible fire, the kind of edge that made every defensive matchup personal. When she guarded Clark during early games that season, the energy between them felt different from a typical rookie-veteran matchup. There were hard screens, sharp stares, and defensive pressure that sometimes pushed right to the edge of what referees would allow. Clips of those moments spread across TikTok and Twitter within minutes. Fans began stitching together highlight reels labeled things like Cunningham versus Clark rivalry, or the tension nobody's talking about. Some videos collected millions of views within days. To the audience watching online, it looked like the beginning of a new rivalry, the fiery veteran trying to test the league's most hyped newcomer. But what most viewers didn't realize was that inside the league, the situation might not have been as simple as a rivalry storyline. Because according to several insiders who later spoke about those early months, Sophie Cunningham wasn't just reacting to Caitlin Clark's presence. She was paying attention to something happening behind the scenes. Something that made her believe Clark's sudden rise wasn't just changing the league's popularity. It might also be changing the league's power structure in ways very few players fully understood. And if that suspicion was correct, the late-night meeting in Miami suddenly started looking a lot less random. Because by the time Sophie decided to reach out to Caitlin Clark directly, she was already convinced the rookie superstar was walking into a situation far bigger than basketball. By the middle of the season, the Clips had taken on a life of their own. Every time Sophie Cunningham and Caitlin Clark shared the floor, fans were already waiting for something to happen. Cameras zoomed in a little tighter. Commentators spoke with just a bit more anticipation. And social media accounts dedicated to WNBA drama were ready to capture every second. It didn't take much. A shoulder bump after a screen. A stare that lasted half a second too long. A defensive play that looked a little more physical than usual. Within minutes, those moments would be clipped, edited, slowed down, and posted online with captions suggesting something bigger was happening between the two players. Real tension. Cunningham hates Clark. The rivalry the league didn't expect. The internet loves simple stories, and this one fit perfectly. A fiery veteran versus the rookie superstar who had suddenly become the center of attention. It was the kind of narrative that sports media thrives on: conflict, personality, and just enough mystery to keep people arguing in the comments. But inside the league, the reality was far more complicated. Players know when cameras are watching. They know when storylines start forming around them. And they know how quickly a single moment can be turned into a narrative that follows them for months. Some athletes lean into those narratives. Others ignore them completely. But a few understand that sometimes those storylines don't grow naturally. Sometimes they're encouraged. As Caitlin Clark's popularity continued to explode, rumors quietly started circulating among agents, marketing teams, and even some players themselves. The league, which had spent years trying to grow its audience, suddenly had something it hadn't had before. A player capable of pulling millions of new viewers toward the sport almost overnight. That kind of attention changes how a league operates. Television networks want bigger storylines. Sponsors want recognizable faces. Marketing departments start shaping the way players are presented to the public. Rivalries become promotional tools. Games between certain teams get pushed into primetime slots. Commentators begin emphasizing specific matchups to keep audiences engaged. In other words, narratives begin to form. And once those narratives exist, they tend to grow whether the players involved actually feel that way or not. For Caitlin Clark, the situation was overwhelming enough on its own. She was adjusting to professional basketball, traveling constantly, dealing with media attention that followed her everywhere, and trying to live up to expectations that seemed to grow every week. Most rookies spend their first season quietly learning the pace of the league. Clark was doing it with the entire sports world watching. But while Clark stayed focused on basketball, Sophie Cunningham was paying attention to something else. The conversations happening off the court. According to several insiders who later spoke about that season, there had been growing discussions among league executives and marketing partners about how to maximize the attention Clark was bringing to the WNBA. The sudden surge in viewership created opportunities the league had never fully experienced before. Bigger sponsorship deals, expanded media coverage, and a chance to position women's basketball at the center of the sports conversation. None of that was inherently negative. In fact, most players wanted exactly that kind of growth. But the question quietly circulating among some athletes wasn't whether the league would promote its biggest star. The question was how far that promotion might go. Because if one player became the centerpiece of every marketing campaign, every broadcast storyline, and every national interview, it could reshape the entire competitive environment around them. Some players worried the league might start pushing certain narratives harder than others. Rivalries could become exaggerated. Personalities could be framed in ways that benefited television ratings rather than reflecting reality. The line between authentic competition and manufactured drama could begin to blur. For Sophie Cunningham, those whispers were impossible to ignore. Unlike many younger players who stayed away from the political side of professional sports, Cunningham had built relationships across different corners of the basketball world. She knew agents, media professionals, and people connected to the business side of the game. Over time, bits of information began reaching her from different directions. None of it was definitive. But together, the pieces started forming a picture that made her uneasy. There were talks about restructuring media strategy, discussions about centralized marketing control, conversations about building long-term promotional plans around a small number of star athletes. And Caitlin Clark's name kept appearing at the center of those discussions. At first, Cunningham tried to ignore it. Rumors travel quickly in professional sports, and most of them never turn into reality. But the more she heard, the more convinced she became that something larger might be developing behind the scenes. Something that could affect not just Clark, but every player in the league. That's when she decided she needed to talk to Caitlin directly. Not during a game. Not in a locker room full of teammates. And definitely not somewhere cameras could easily find them. If the conversations Sophie had been hearing were even partially true, the only place she could explain it safely was somewhere far away from the league's spotlight. Which is why, weeks later, she ended up on a flight to Miami. And why the meeting inside that oceanfront lounge would soon become one of the most talked about moments in WNBA history. The lounge itself wasn't the kind of place most people could just walk into. Tucked along a quiet stretch of Miami's waterfront, the venue was known for hosting private events, celebrity gatherings, and late-night meetings that rarely made headlines. There were no bright signs outside, no crowds waiting with cameras. Most people inside valued one thing above everything else: privacy. Which is exactly why Caitlin Clark agreed to meet there. At least, that's what several people familiar with the situation later suggested. Clark had originally traveled to Miami to step away from the noise surrounding her rookie season. For weeks, every move she made had been dissected by sports media and fans online. A few days away from the spotlight sounded like the perfect reset. But Sophie Cunningham's message changed that plan. When Sophie first reached out, the request reportedly caught Clark off guard. The two had barely spoken outside of brief interactions during games. From Clark's perspective, Cunningham was just another tough competitor she happened to face on the court. Nothing more. So when Sophie asked to meet privately, Clark initially hesitated. It wasn't hostility, it was caution. In professional sports, unexpected messages from rivals usually come with a reason, and Clark wasn't sure what that reason might be. But Cunningham insisted the conversation was important. Important enough that it couldn't wait until the next time their teams crossed paths. Eventually, Clark agreed. Late that evening, a black SUV dropped both players off outside the oceanfront lounge within minutes of each other. According to staff members working that night, the atmosphere between them felt serious from the moment they arrived. There were no friendly hugs, no casual greetings. Just a quiet walk to a corner table where the lighting was low and the surrounding booths were mostly empty. At first, the conversation appeared normal enough. Two professional athletes discussing the chaos of the season, the pressure of national attention, and the strange experience of having millions of strangers analyzing every moment of their careers. But after a few minutes, the tone changed. Witnesses later described Sophie leaning forward across the table, speaking in a voice low enough that no one nearby could hear the full conversation. Clark listened carefully, occasionally shaking her head as if she wasn't fully convinced by what she was hearing. Then Sophie opened her backpack. Inside were several folders. She slid one across the table. From a distance, employees could see Clark flipping through the pages slowly. At first her expression didn't change much. But as she kept reading, something shifted. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes moved faster across the documents. At one point she reportedly stopped, looked up at Sophie, and asked a question that couldn't be heard from across the room. Sophie responded immediately. Whatever she said made Clark go quiet again. One server who passed their table later described the moment as the instant the entire conversation turned serious. According to that employee, Clark looked less like a player talking to a rival and more like someone processing information they weren't expecting to hear. It wasn't long before Sophie leaned in again and said something that one nearby witness partially overheard. "If they go through with this, it changes everything." That sentence alone might not have meant much to anyone else in the room. But to Clark, it clearly carried weight. She stared down at the papers for several seconds before asking another question. The response from Sophie came quickly. This time Clark's reaction was impossible to miss. Her expression reportedly shifted from confusion to disbelief. For the first time that night, she looked genuinely shaken. No one else in the lounge knew exactly what those documents contained. Some later speculated they were related to internal league planning. Others believed they might have been rumors Sophie had collected from different sources around the basketball world. But whatever Clark saw in those pages, it had clearly changed the tone of the meeting. What started as a quiet conversation between two competitors now looked like something much more serious. Two players leaning over a table, speaking urgently while the rest of the room carried on with normal conversation. For nearly 20 minutes, the discussion continued that way. Then something happened that neither of them seemed to expect. A small flash of light appeared from across the room. At first it looked like someone taking a quick photo of the waterfront outside. But when Caitlin Clark turned her head toward the source of the flash, her expression immediately froze. Because the person lowering the phone wasn't a random guest. It was another WNBA star. And the moment their eyes met, Clark realized this meeting was no longer private. For a split second, Caitlin Clark thought she might be mistaken. The lighting in the lounge was dim, and the figure across the room had already started lowering their phone. But the moment that person stepped slightly into the glow of a nearby lamp, there was no doubt left. It was Sabrina Ionescu, another one of the biggest names in women's basketball. A player known for her leadership, her clutch performances, and her reputation as one of the league's most respected stars. And right now, she had just been filming them. Clark's reaction was instant. Her body stiffened as she leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Sabrina across the room. The two players had crossed paths many times before, through national team events, media appearances, and the tight-knit circles of professional basketball. Seeing Sabrina somewhere like this wasn't impossible. But seeing her quietly recording a private meeting between Clark and Sophie Cunningham? That felt different. For a few seconds, no one moved. Sabrina simply slipped the phone back into her pocket with calm, controlled precision. She didn't smile. She didn't approach the table. Instead, she gave Clark a long, unreadable look, The kind of glance that left more questions than answers. Then she turned and walked toward the back exit of the lounge. Just like that. Gone. Clark immediately turned back to Sophie. What was she doing here? She asked, her voice low but sharp with confusion. Sophie didn't answer right away. She rubbed her temples, clearly processing what had just happened. When she finally spoke, her tone carried something Clark hadn't heard from her before. Concern. Sabrina doesn't show up somewhere like this by accident, she said quietly. That single sentence hung in the air between them. Up until that moment, the meeting had already felt tense. The documents. The warnings. The possibility that something unusual might be happening behind the scenes of the league. But Sabrina's sudden appearance introduced a completely new layer to the situation. Because if she had been recording the meeting, the obvious question was why. Clark's mind started racing through possibilities. Maybe Sabrina had simply recognized them and captured a quick video out of curiosity. Maybe it was just one of those strange coincidences that happen when professional athletes travel in the same circles. But Sophie's reaction suggested something else entirely. According to people who later discussed the incident, Sophie had already suspected that certain players in the league had closer relationships with executives and media partners than others. Not in a sinister way necessarily. Professional sports often involve athletes working closely with sponsors, broadcasters, and marketing teams. Still, the timing felt strange. Clark and Sophie had chosen this location precisely because it was quiet and far from the usual league spotlight. Yet somehow another high-profile player had appeared in the same place. At the exact moment their conversation reached its most serious point. Clark leaned back in her chair, trying to process everything at once. First, the documents Sophie had shown her. Then the possibility that those documents pointed toward something larger happening within the league structure. And now the sudden appearance of a third player who had just recorded part of their conversation. The situation was becoming harder to explain as coincidence. Around them, the lounge continued operating like nothing unusual had happened. Music played softly. Conversations drifted from nearby tables. But at their corner booth, the atmosphere had completely changed. Clark could feel it. The sense that their private meeting might no longer be private. And if someone had already captured video of them together, it meant the story could spread far beyond that room at any moment. Moments like this are exactly why stories around sports can escalate so quickly. One unexpected sighting, one short video clip, and suddenly millions of fans start asking questions. Actually, if you enjoy following stories like this, the hidden moments, the behind-the-scenes tensions that shape what we see on the court, this is exactly the kind of deep dive we explore on this channel. So if you're new here, consider subscribing. It helps more basketball fans find these stories when they start unfolding in real time. Back at the table, Clark leaned closer to Sophie again. Do you think she's going to post that? She asked. Sophie hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. But if she does, this situation might get a lot bigger than either of us expected. And as it turned out, that prediction would become reality faster than anyone in that lounge could have imagined. Because by the time the sun came up the next morning, the entire internet was already talking about Miami. The first video appeared online just after sunrise. At first it looked like one of those grainy clips that usually circulate for a few hours and disappear. The footage was shaky, filmed from a distance, and barely 10 seconds long. But it showed something unmistakable. Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham rushing out of the Miami lounge. Both of them moving quickly, their expressions tense, Sophie gripping a backpack tightly while Clark scanned the street as if she expected cameras to appear at any second. Then the clip cut. That alone would have been enough to spark curiosity. But the person who uploaded the video included one detail that turned the moment into a full-blown internet storm. In the background of the clip, just behind the lounge entrance, another figure was visible, holding a phone, recording everything. Within minutes, viewers began zooming in on the frame, enhancing the brightness, and freezing the moment where the person's face briefly turned toward the camera. And that's when people realized who it was. Sabrina Ionescu. Once that realization spread, the story moved faster than anyone could control. Sports accounts on Twitter reposted the clip. TikTok creators stitched it into longer breakdowns analyzing every movement in the video. basketball forums filled with speculation about what had happened inside the lounge. By mid-morning, the clip had millions of views. And the internet had already split into three very different camps. The first group immediately rallied around Caitlin Clark. To them, the footage looked like someone who had just been caught in the middle of something serious. Fans pointed out the tension in Clark's face, the way she moved quickly toward the waiting car, the fact that Sophie appeared to be protecting whatever was inside that backpack. Some people believed the two players had discovered something about the league that wasn't supposed to become public. Others thought Clark had simply been overwhelmed by the growing pressure around her career and needed privacy. But the biggest theory spreading online was that Sophie Cunningham had been trying to warn Clark about something happening behind the scenes. The second group focused on Sophie herself. For months, many fans had treated her like the villain in Clark's story. The aggressive defender. The player who always seemed to bring extra intensity when facing the league's newest star. Now, suddenly, people were reconsidering that narrative. If Sophie had flown to Miami to meet Clark privately, maybe the rivalry fans had been watching all season wasn't what it appeared to be. Maybe the tension on the court had masked a different reality entirely. Some fans even started calling her the one player willing to risk her reputation to tell Clark something important. But the third group on the internet had a very different reaction. They focused on Sabrina. Screenshots of the moment she appeared in the background of the video spread everywhere. People slowed down the clip frame by frame, trying to determine exactly what she had been doing. Was she simply recording the scene like any curious bystander? Was she documenting the meeting for her own reasons? Or had she been sent there intentionally? The speculation exploded. Some fans accused her of spying for league executives. Others argued that she might have been trying to protect Clark by capturing evidence of what happened inside the lounge. A few even suggested she could have been warning Clark indirectly. But the truth was that nobody outside that small group of players knew exactly why Sabrina had been there. And the more people debated it online, the bigger the story became. By late morning, major sports media outlets had picked up the clip. Commentators who normally focused on NBA headlines were suddenly discussing the strange Miami meeting between three of the WNBA's most recognizable players. Then the league itself responded. At 10:03 a.m., the WNBA released a short statement acknowledging the unauthorized circulation of private footage involving league players. The message was brief, careful, and offered almost no explanation. They simply said the situation was being evaluated. That response didn't calm the internet. If anything, it made things worse. Fans immediately began asking why the league sounded so cautious about a video that, on the surface, appeared to show nothing more than two players leaving a building. If there was nothing unusual about the situation, why release a statement at all? Within hours, the story had spread far beyond basketball. Podcasts were discussing it. Sports journalists were posting cryptic comments suggesting there might be more information coming. Even athletes from other leagues began hinting at the situation online. What started as a quiet late-night meeting in Miami had turned into the biggest conversation in women's basketball almost overnight. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos were the two people who had been sitting at that table when everything began. Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham. Because while fans debated theories online, the truth was that both players already knew something the rest of the world didn't. Something that made the Miami meeting far more serious than a simple viral moment. And according to the few insiders who later spoke about that night, the situation was about to become even more complicated. While the internet was busy arguing about the Miami video, another piece of the story was quietly developing far away from social media. Because Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham hadn't simply disappeared after leaving the lounge that night. According to several reports that surfaced later, the black SUV waiting outside hadn't been arranged by the league, security, or media representatives. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had been watching the situation unfold for years. A former WNBA star. The driver was Diggins-Smith. For longtime fans of the league, Diggins-Smith's name carried a complicated history. She had once been one of the most recognizable faces in women's basketball. A dynamic guard, a multiple-time All-Star, and a player known for speaking openly about issues inside the league long before most athletes felt comfortable doing so. But over the years, Her relationship with league leadership had reportedly become strained. She had criticized how certain situations were handled, questioned how players were supported, and openly pushed for improvements in areas like compensation, scheduling, and treatment of athletes. Some people admired that honesty. Others believed it had quietly placed her at odds with powerful voices behind the scenes. So when rumors began circulating that Diggins-Smith was the person who picked up Clark and Cunningham that night, it immediately added another layer of intrigue to the entire situation. Because if anyone understood the complicated politics that can exist inside professional sports leagues, it was someone who had already experienced those tensions firsthand. Inside the SUV that night, the atmosphere was reportedly quiet at first. Clark was still processing everything Sophie had shown her at the lounge. The documents. The warnings. The possibility that the league's rapid expansion around her popularity might come with expectations she hadn't fully understood. For most of her career, Clark had focused on basketball. Scoring, competing, improving every part of her game. The business side of professional sports, contracts, marketing strategy, league politics, had mostly remained in the background. But now those two worlds were colliding. And according to people familiar with the conversation that followed, Skylar Diggins-Smith didn't waste much time getting straight to the point. She reportedly told Clark that the sudden attention surrounding her career had created opportunities the league had never experienced before. Massive viewership numbers. Corporate sponsors eager to associate themselves with the sport. Media networks looking for a central storyline to promote. All of that attention could be a good thing. But it could also lead to pressure. Pressure to appear in certain campaigns. Pressure to participate in specific promotional narratives. Pressure to represent the future of the league in ways that might extend beyond basketball itself. Diggins-Smith, having spent years navigating similar expectations, understood how complicated that situation could become. Her message to Clark wasn't necessarily that anyone was conspiring against her. Professional sports leagues are businesses, and businesses often build their strategies around their most marketable stars. Instead, the warning was about awareness. When an athlete becomes the centerpiece of an entire league's growth strategy, the decisions surrounding their career can start affecting far more people than just the player themselves. Agents get involved. Sponsors get involved. Executives start planning years ahead. And sometimes the athlete at the center of it all doesn't fully realize how many moving parts are shaping the narrative around them. According to the rumors that circulated later, Sophie Cunningham had already begun noticing signs of that shift. Conversations among agents, unusual marketing discussions, and whispers that the league might be preparing to restructure certain aspects of how players were promoted and managed. None of it had been confirmed publicly. But together, the pieces had made her uneasy enough to reach out to Clark. Now, sitting in the SUV with Diggins-Smith behind the wheel and Sophie beside her, Clark was hearing those concerns from someone who had already lived through the complicated relationship between star athletes and league expectations. It was a lot to absorb in a single night. Especially for someone who had entered the league only months earlier. Clark reportedly listened carefully as Diggins-Smith explained how quickly public narratives can form around professional athletes. One season can turn a player into the face of an entire sport. And once that happens, every move they make begins carrying weight far beyond the court. The question Clark now faced was simple. Did she want to fully step into that role, the central figure of the league's next era, even if it meant navigating pressures she had never expected? Or did she want to push back and maintain more control over the direction of her own career? That decision didn't need to be made immediately. But after the Miami meeting, it was clear the moment was coming. Because by the time Clark checked her phone later that night, the video from outside the lounge had already begun circulating online. And the conversation surrounding her name was growing faster than anyone inside that SUV could have predicted. The situation had moved beyond a private meeting. Now the entire basketball world was watching. And the next move Caitlin Clark made could shape the future of the league in ways no one fully understood yet. By the next afternoon, the Miami incident had officially become the biggest story in women's basketball. Sports shows were replaying the footage on giant screens. Commentators were debating what the meeting meant. Fans were analyzing every frame of the video as if it were a championship replay. And through it all, one question kept coming up again and again. What exactly had Sophie Cunningham shown Caitlin Clark that night? Because the truth was, nobody outside that small group of players actually knew. The internet had theories, of course. Some believed the documents Sophie carried were related to league marketing plans. Others thought they might reveal discussions about how the WNBA planned to structure future media deals around its biggest stars. A few fans even speculated that the papers hinted at larger changes coming to how the league promoted rivalries, endorsements, and player appearances. But without confirmation, those theories remained exactly what they were: speculation. Still, the speculation alone was powerful enough to ignite a massive debate about something professional sports rarely talk about openly: control. Who controls the narrative around athletes? Is it the leagues? The media companies broadcasting the games? The sponsors investing millions into the sport? Or should that control belong to the players themselves? Caitlin Clark, whether she wanted it or not, had suddenly found herself standing right in the middle of that conversation. Not because she had started it, but because her rise had changed the entire landscape of the league almost overnight. For years, the WNBA had been fighting for greater visibility. Now, thanks to Clark's popularity and the momentum building around women's basketball, the league was experiencing the kind of attention it had always hoped for. With that attention came opportunity. But it also came pressure. Pressure to shape the future carefully. Pressure to manage public narratives. Pressure to balance the success of one superstar with the careers of dozens of other elite athletes competing for the same spotlight. That balancing act is something every professional sports league eventually faces. The difference now was that the conversation had become public. Fans were asking questions. Players were being pulled into debates they normally avoided. And the mysterious Miami meeting had turned Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, and Sabrina Ionescu into the center of a story far bigger than one late-night conversation. As the days passed, none of the players involved made any detailed public statements about what happened inside the lounge. Clark continued focusing on basketball. Sophie returned to her team responsibilities. Sabrina avoided fueling the online speculation. But the moment itself didn't disappear. If anything, it became one of those strange turning points that fans continue discussing long after the headlines fade. Because moments like that often hint at larger shifts happening beneath the surface of professional sports. The business side. The marketing side. The power structures that shape how athletes are presented to the world. Whether the Miami meeting revealed something dramatic or simply exposed how complicated modern sports can be, one thing became clear. Caitlin Clark's career was no longer just about scoring points and winning games. She had become one of the most influential figures in the entire sport. And when an athlete reaches that level of influence, every decision they make starts carrying weight far beyond the court. Which raises the question that fans are still debating right now. If you were in Caitlin Clark's position, what would you do? Would you focus entirely on your career and ignore the noise surrounding the league? Or would you step into the spotlight and challenge the system shaping that spotlight? That's exactly why this story has captured so many people's attention. Because it's not just about a viral video in Miami. It's about the future of women's basketball. Now I'm really curious to hear what you think. Do you believe Sophie Cunningham was trying to warn Caitlin Clark about something serious behind the scenes? Do you think Sabrina Ionescu was documenting the moment for a reason? Or was it just a coincidence? And most importantly, do you think the rise of one superstar can truly reshape an entire league? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read as many of them as I can, and the best discussions often end up shaping future videos on this channel. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most talked about moments in recent WNBA history, make sure you like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. Because stories like this don't end with one headline. Sometimes the real story only begins after the cameras stop rolling.